Tatulyan is a writer, philosopher, and designer with a degree in arts and design, a master's in applied philosophy, and a Ph.D. in philosophy. She is the author of the book The Radical Singularity and currently dedicates herself to various interdisciplinary studies on subjectivity, posthumanism, and modernity. Her thinking unfolds as a systematic rereading of the modern project, with a profound hermeneutics of subjectivity, and under a fundamental premise that the future should not design humans, but rather, we should design a more human future.
Thank you everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I was very happy with at least the possibility of the online participation. And you probably already have seen the presentation. First of all, when I knew about the theme of SIGraDi this year, I was very happy to know about this whole concept of accelerated landscapes, especially because this was very accurate at the moment of speaking about posthumanism. A very accurate analogy framework is actually talking about posthumanism in terms of geography, in terms of landscapes, in terms of maps of reference. So this was a very accurate framework from which start talking about posthumanism, to bring the discussion about posthumanism. I don't know how many of you are aware of what is posthumanism. Sometimes it's confused with transhumanism. We probably will see the differences during this talk, but it's a very contemporary, yet we could say even historical way of thinking. So what we're going to do today in the terms of this presentation is basically draw an outline about what is this type of thinking, and what is the philosophical aspect of it, and why it defines the future maps of what it is to be a human being. And actually, as someone that has both studies, let's say, in design and in philosophy, the main reasons in which I was for which I was interested in this type of thought, school of thought, was first of all because as a modern scholar I'm always going to be interested in criticisms to the modern project, and second because posthumanism is drawing the lines of what it is going to be the future horizon of what it is to be a human. So I'm naturally going to be interested also in any type of project that aims to present itself as the alternative for the future of humanity. So I think this would be a little bit of a framework. I would like to share screen to start with the presentation. So we start diving into this whole realm that it's posthumanism. So basically, when talking about posthumanism, I always like starting with this image, which very graphically, very visually depicts what we talk about when we talk about posthumanism. The first image is obviously the birth of Venus, the famous painting, the icon of the Renaissance by Sandro Botticelli. And then the second image is actually a performance or an intervention done by Salvia, who's a posthuman aesthetic artist. And I think both images show us two ways of conceiving the human body, two ways of conceiving the human, two philosophies, two ways of conceiving even the body of a woman, two philosophies, right? Two conceptualizations of the human, completely different. And I think the main question is what happened so that we could go from the first image to the second image? Or the question should be, what happened to us in order to switch from one paradigm to the other paradigm? In terms of this presentation about posthuman landscapes, I would like to, let's say, divide the whole content in four main fields. First of all, we obviously need to know about humanism if we're going to talk about posthumanism. So the first block, we will be talking about what is the conception of humanism and what is actually the fundament of the antithesis of posthumanism. Let's say what posthumanism wants to be against. In the second part, we're going to understand the end of this paradigm, the end of humanism, and all these processes of decentering of the subject. And in a third instance, we're going to see and discuss about the posthuman landscape, and then focus specifically on the posthuman body, which is, let's say, the platform for all these different types of technologies and different types of interventions that the posthumanist philosophy allows us. So posthumanism already shows, obviously, the prefix post, which is something very common in the time we live in. We obviously speak about being in the postmodern time. We speak about post-truth paradigms. We speak about post-metaphysical epoch. We speak about posthumanism and so on and so on. So we live in an epoch in which we're constantly trying to overcome the main concepts, the main narratives that were structuring the basis of the modern project. Basically, everything happening at least in the past 100 years, a will or a desire of overcoming all these settled paradigms, the modern, the truth, the metaphysical, the human, the subject, and so on. So within this whole world, posthumanism appears to be another expression in the fields of humanities, philosophy, anthropology, technologies, and so on. So to locate ourselves in this new map, which is the posthuman map, I have created this, let's say, this big map of concepts. So we understand where are we located when we talk about posthumanism in terms of paradigm and in terms of time. So we said that we are currently in the postmodern epoch. Postmodernity obviously says that we are what comes after modernity, probably after in terms of time, but against in terms of concept. So modernity was the paradigm that ruled the Western world, at least until the coming of the postmodern era, right? So modernity was this epoch characterized mainly by the construction of the subject. We can actually talk, sometimes they even speak in terms of identity, modernity and subjectivity. Modernity was the time in which the human being, let's say, finally understood its condition as a subject. This is subject, it comes from Latin, subjectum. Sub is what lies underneath. Jectum, it's what's thrown, what's out. So what lies in the basis as a foundation of what is out there or what exists. This is what actually Aristotle spoke in terms of hypokeimenon, this substance that doesn't change, that is the foundation of things, and that the human being is going to represent that in modernity. The human being is the foundation of things. So the two main categories that rule the modern epoch are the categories of subject and the category of reason. And all these created a modern paradigm in terms of anthropocentrism and humanism. Anthropocentrism obviously speaks in terms of the centrality of anthropos, and kentron, obviously the center. And humanism is a paradigm that is also centered in, let's say, it's constructed around the idea that the human being is the measure of all things. In this epoch, we also have the construction of the great narratives. This is socialism, the Enlightenment, communism, all these narratives like freedom, equality, that ruled the modern epoch, kind of like the solid foundations, the metaphysical ideas that were guiding all the discourses of the modern period. In terms of philosophies, we're going to have a predominance, let's say, of idealist philosophies. This is because idealist philosophies start from the subject. The subject is actually the starting point of any type of idealist philosophy. So we mainly have Descartes, Kant, and Hegel as the main representatives of, let's say, this line of thought. Obviously, modernity is a very varied epoch. So we're also going to have rationalism, empiricism, right? Like many diverse types of philosophy. And in terms of art, we can speak about Renaissance, Neoclassicism, and Romanticism. And basically, the end of Romanticism marks the beginning of a new period, of a new world. And we're going to see this in a little bit of detail further, but postmodernity comes forward precisely with the main aim of overcoming modernity. So if in modernity we had the construction of the subject, in the postmodern epoch we have the deconstruction of the subject. The subject has died, as Foucault is going to say. Even the human has died. we obviously start seeing the foundations of the deconstruction of the category of the subject and reason. There's going to be a rise of anti-humanist philosophies. Anti-humanism is actually later going to be understood as post-structuralism. And obviously, along with the critique to the ideas of subject and reason, we're going to have the deconstruction of those big paradigms, big narratives, or philosophical and metaphysical ideas that were ruling the modern epoch. In terms of philosophy, we have this what Ricoeur called the masters of suspicion. Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, everyone from their own field, basically putting in doubt this centrality of the subject that had mainly characterized modernity. And in terms of art, we're going to start seeing avant-garde art, the avant-garde branches of art, postmodern art, and the impossibility of talking about one single type of art, because art is already diversified at this point. There's not only one narrative or one discourse that the art expression is going to be under. And so posthumanism, in all this context, basically arises as an of dissolution of the subject. Obviously, continuing not only the criticism of subject and of reason that postmodernity started, but also as a criticism to the category of the human. We're going to see this in further detail as we go through the presentation. But this is for you to have an idea of where are we located historically. Obviously, posthumanism is going to seek for the overcoming of humanism, the overcoming of the great narratives, and is going to radicalize all these ideas by anti-humanism that has started, let's say, middle of the 20th century. And the posthuman ideas are also going to function along many other movements of time, which are the movements of the other, the movements of minorities, the sexual minorities, post-colonial movements, ecologist movements. All these are going to be complementary to the posthuman thought, because all of them are going to seek for one common thing, which is the overcoming of the subject, which is the human being, basically, as the epistemological foundation of things. And in terms of aesthetics, and by the way, this all these movement in the humanities is obviously going to be complemented and fueled by the new inventions of technology. We're going to see the influence of the cybernetic revolution, the information revolution, how these new ways of thinking the world and the human are also going to be very helpful for posthumanists to develop their philosophy. And in terms of aesthetics, we're going to have what is called posthuman aesthetics, which are different types of, let's say, interventions or ways of conceiving the human body or aesthetics in general. So we said that we're going to start with what is humanism. We couldn't be talking about posthumanism and the posthuman landscape. We couldn't talk about the world that posthumanists are thinking about as the future of humanity. If we didn't know what is humanism, what are they trying to overcome with their own philosophy? So we said that the main core of modernity is the idea of the subject. The idea of a subject is a specific way of understanding the individuum that started in modernity. It's a construction of modernity. This is not something arbitrary, obviously. This is something that happened as a consequence of many, many changes that were happening concretely in the life world in the modern period that created a new way of the human being of being there in the world, which is what we called the subject, the foundation. The human being is the foundation of things. These events, you know them, obviously. We can talk about the humanism, Renaissance, the printing revolution put forward by Gutenberg, then the encyclopedia by the Enlightenment philosophers. We also the scientific revolution that completely switches the way we see the world and the place of the human being in that world. Also the Protestant Reformation, which completely changed the world in which the individual relates to God and how it even produces wealth, which is what, for example, led Max Weber talk about the importance of the Reformation in the advance of capitalism, for example. And we also have Enlightenment, which is, we could say, even the peak of modernity, with all these, great philosophers of Enlightenment, Voltaire, Diderot, D'Alembert, Kant, Rousseau, and so on, constructing all this peak of reason, this peak of a paradigm that was called to be a transformation society. So humanism, again, we need to know what posthumanism wants to overcome, right? So humanism was this movement that was born in the Platonic Academy of Florence in Italy, and was obviously a reaction to scholasticism, bringing back the study of humanities, Humanitas Studia, which was something that was basically put aside during the Middle Ages, and was aiming to bring back all these liberal arts and these human studies that were obviously developed during the Greco-Roman period, that were forgotten or put aside during the scholasticism. And obviously these diverse changes that start happening with the humanist movement, that obviously couldn't happen without the intervention of the Medici, for example, of the new drawing economic system that was happening, the new ideas that were fueling already an anthropocentrism, and we're putting the human being as the measure of all things, and starting understanding as the epistemological foundation of things, which is what we called the subjectum. So there is a whole diverse conjunction of events that are happening at this time, that are switching the self-understanding, first of all, of the individual, of itself, and thus creating a new way of the human being there in the world. Obviously, this conception of the human grows parallel to the detachment of the human from the religious perspective, which is creating a more autonomous idea of the human being, which foundation is going to be basically rational ideas and reason. So the most important thing, and this is going to be one of the main targets of posthumanists, it's, as we said, the idea of the subject. First of all, the word subject, it's already, we know, a very problematic word sometimes. This is not only the case in English, this is also the case in French, in Spanish, and many Latin languages, which is, for example, in Spanish, we say sujeto to subject, and sujeto, which could be understood as this modern idea of understanding the human being. You can also understand it as sujeto, as something that's attached, for example, which could mean even the opposite conceptually. Same happens with subjectivity, which is often used as a synonym for the particular, what belongs to your own opinion or something like that, when subjectivity in terms of modern philosophy can mean, again, something very opposite to that. So focusing on the idea of the subject now helps us understand what is the main target that the posthumanists are going to have. So we said that subject, which obviously comes from Latin subjectum, the foundation of things, the basis of things. We said that this was what Aristotle called hypokeimenon, when he wanted to understand what it is what doesn't change in a world of accidents. What is the substance that always remains the same in a world that is constantly changing? And in the modern period, especially in the early modern period, when in the first, let's say, claim of modernity done with Cartesian philosophy by the hands of René Descartes, this idea of subjectum, of hypokeimenon, obviously not with that terminology, but in terms of the way Descartes wrote his own philosophy, acquired the shape of of the self. So the self became the foundation of things. The famous saying by Descartes, cogito ergo sum, means exactly that. Means I think, therefore I exist. So my own thought that I think is the foundation of existence. And the only medium to reach any type of certainty starts with the self. Truth is not going to be anymore something that's imposed from outside, something that comes from above, something that's written in a book, but something that I have to achieve myself. It's part of a personal practice, a very introspective activity of the individual. So we see the importance of the individual here in the moment of history. So the self is going to be the only medium to achieve any type of certainty. Obviously, we should not confuse this with egotistical thoughts, but with epistemological grounds, and seeing the self as the foundation of any type of knowledge, because in the end, any knowledge is only knowledge for someone, and that someone is actually always going to be a self. So what remains permanent for this epoch is the self, because in every representation, in every knowledge, in every experience of a human, there's something that doesn't change ever, basically until we die. And that's the idea of the self, the ego of the human. So that is the foundation, what never changes. That's why the self becomes the hypokeimenon. And done obviously by what was the discovery of the cogito, of the ego cogito, by René Descartes. Obviously, it's not that modernity was just born by a book, but this is a very critical moment in which modernity acquires, let's say, a very explicit spirit. And it's not by chance that Descartes is actually called the father of modernity, because of all these transformations induced by his own philosophy. And this opens a whole epoch of philosophies of subjectivity. This is actually later going to be called and criticized, obviously, by postmodern philosophers, and not only, but by calling it metaphysics of the subject, because basically it creates a whole epoch in which everything is justified in an idea of a subject, and that idea is a metaphysical construct. So this is going to be taken, this is obviously the criticism of this way of thinking. But putting the criticism aside, we're speaking about a time in which all philosophies are going to be grounded in the idea of subjectivity as the beginning of any type of reflective activity. And obviously, this conception of the subject is an achievement of modernity, because it was because of everything that was happening gradually in the modern epoch that we could finally talk about the human being as subject, the human being as the epistemological foundation of things. Obviously, an epoch that is going to be very optimistic towards the human. It's the same epoch in which we talk about, for example, in Enlightenment, about the idea of progress, about the idea of all these human experiences and history growing teleologically towards the betterment of humanity. So basically, all the spirit of the Enlightenment is actually going to be characterized by this optimism towards the human, and thus optimism towards the future of the human being, because of the belief of the power of its capacities. The Vitruvian Man, it's called by many actually to be kind of like the visual representation of this idea of the human as the measure of all things, the human as the center of this new world. Obviously, this creation by Leonardo da Vinci, inspired in all the mathematical writings and theories of Vitruvio, precisely depict this body that has understood even the mathematics behind it, a conception of the human being based in this universal mathematics, of the world being a mathematical phenomena, and the human being another mathematical phenomena, because it belongs to it. So it creates an idea of the human being that is completely rational, completely structured, and that also have this picture in mind, because when we get to the posthuman ways of understanding the human body, this image is actually going to be one of the main criticized ideas for, let's say, in quotes, the philosophy that it represents at its base. So we said that, I mean, there's many debates on when is the of modernity. Obviously, there's not a day in which it happens. I mean, a group of philosophers didn't gather to just sign, the the end of modernity or something along those lines. But we can, generally speaking, start seeing when we notice the first let's say crisis of the modern project. Hegel already in the Romantic period was already noticing the diverse crisis happening with modern thought, especially with this constant, let's say, division of the world between, mind and world, human and nature, res cogitans, res extensa. There's constantly like a division between the way of understanding the world, because there's obviously a very clear and defined and distinct way of understanding. So there's a very clear way of understanding what it is a human. There's something that's always going to appear as an other, let's say. So this is already seen by Hegel in the end of the Romantic period as kind of like the beginning of the problematization of modernity. And Hegel was already speaking about the end of the old world, the beginning of the Neue Zeit, which was the new time, the new world, and noticing kind of like for the first time a modernity that is becoming conscious of itself, that is stopping and is looking back at everything that has happened in modernity, and it's able to problematize the modern issues for the first time, kind of like looking back in perspective at what modernity is, modernity was, what is going to be the future of modernity. So when we speak about the end of modernity, we can locate ourselves basically in a post-romantic world, taking romanticism as both the pinnacle and at the same time the beginning of the end of the modern project. So gradually, after the post-romantic period, we start seeing, let's say, a critique of the category of subject and reason, a revision of the modern project, the basis of anti-humanism, as we said, the death of the human, the death of the subject, that was called by Michel Foucault. And at the same time, in terms of philosophy, we have the masters of suspicion, as we see, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, each of them from their perspective criticizing the modern project. We have phenomenology, existentialism, critical theory, structuralism, post-structuralism, the postmodern philosophy, positivism. All these philosophies, probably besides phenomenology, all going to be aims to overcoming the modern project and overcoming this this centrality of the subject and of reason. They're all going to be revising the modern project, especially after the First World War, which is a very tragic, cruel, machined, traumatic war for humanity. This was seen precisely as, wow, this is the consequence of modernity. This was the worst thing that could happen because of modernity. Each of these philosophers, from a perspective, for example, I don't know, we can just take Marx's criticism to modernity. I mean, how can Marx talk about the centrality of the subject when he's writing philosophy about the proletariat, which is a class that's being completely oppressed in those factories and completely determined by the criteria and by the environment they work in, completely alienated from their environment. So impossible to talk about the centrality of the subject in these contexts. And this gets even, let's say, more clear after the First World War, which is basically the extreme case and the main reason why this was the centrality of reason, let's say. The critical theory, for example, by this idea of instrumental reason is going to say this, that the tyranny of reason is basically this reason that's only means to an end and everything is calculation and so on. So we start seeing a constant criticism to modernity because of the pathologies of modernity, because of this deviation of the modern project that happened because of diverse events by the end of modernity. As we said, mid 20th century, we start seeing all these movements of the other, post-colonialism, environmentalism, the third wave feminism, especially ecologism, animalism, and many movements that are precisely the others of what? The others of the subject, the others of this idea of the human being as a center of all things. And what they are going to understand as subject is actually male, white, European, etc., etc. So this paradigm is going to need to be demolished by all these ideas of all these philosophies of the other. Obviously, plus the cybernetic revolution, which is going to introduce those changes on the way of understanding the world and the human being, and also the basis of posthumanism happen here in this context. At the intersection between the humanities, the new anthropologies, the new technologies, the new ways of thinking the human. So in this map, in this intersection of roads, it's where the posthuman project is going to be built. So says Alain de Libera in his book, The Invention of the Modern Subject, he says the death of a subject is therefore the supreme death, the everything capturing death. It is not the death of a man as a being, but the death of the epistemological condition that had placed him as a foundation, as a subjectum. Foucault writes the death of the subject in capital letters, of the subject as the origin and foundation of knowledge, of freedom, of language, of history. Basically, this is what we talk about when we say the death of the subject. It's the death of this human being understood as the foundation of all these spheres of knowledge and spheres of life. Basically, at some point, I was going to draw a timeline to understand modernity, postmodernity, and posthumanism. And I'm not going to lie to you, I had a very hard time depicting this timeline to understand what happens actually in the dialectic between these epochs. And I think the best way of understanding this was with this graph, probably. We have modernity, we have the beautiful, straight, rational line of progress that starts from, the Renaissance, we go through the Enlightenment, we achieve Romanticism, and then slowly as we detach ourselves from the modern period, from this organized world of ideas, of metaphysical ruling ideas that structure all the narratives we're in, we get into postmodernity. And the picture starts being very chaotic because we don't even have one, let's say, single way of understanding things or one umbrella paradigm, but everything starts to go in its own direction. Everything starts to go in its own logic. This is why we have all these different philosophies, and there's even a plus in the end because we could even continue this, which makes it very hard to actually say, okay, what defines the postmodern epoch? Probably what defines the postmodern epoch is we overcome the modern without even having defined your own. Basically, you know what you're against, but you still don't know what you are, which is what happens with many of these post prefixes. And then in the middle of that whirlwind of the postmodern thought, you have posthumanism, which is kind of like out of the geography, out of the Euclidean and rational geography of the modern epoch. There we find posthumanism. So we said that the end of modernity happened precisely because of the abandonment of the modern project. So Habermas talks about this in the philosophical discourse of modernity. And he says, from this perspective, a self-sufficiently advanced modernization of society has separated itself from the impulses of a cultural modernity that has seemingly become obsolete in the meantime. It only carries out the functional laws of economy and state and technology and science, which are supposed to have amalgamated into a system that cannot be influenced. Basically, the cultural modernity has lost its touch with the processes of modernization. The processes start happening with their own laws, with the laws of economy, technology, science, state, etc. But they are independent of that philosophical modernity. Actually, this image from the Modern Times, the movie by Charles Chaplin, I think it depicts very well that world we're talking about in this moment. It's a world, actually it's the world that probably Marx was experiencing when he wrote his political theory and economic theory, and even philosophical, we could say. It's a world in which the human, it's not the center anymore. It's the world in which machines are defining the new landscape of the human world. And it's a world in which as in this image, you probably saw the movie in which Charles Chaplin starts, basically adjusting everything on its way because he's just going crazy in this automated process, and he in the end becomes part of the machine. This is probably the key of this image, which is a human being becoming part of a bigger machine, of a bigger technological system that is what the world has already become. So in this context, we obviously have transhumanism. We could speak about it later if there's time, but we can probably get directly to the posthuman landscape. So we said that posthumanism is born at the crossroads between technology, philosophy, humanities, anthropology, all these changes that are happening in this mid-20th century. Actually, the first time that the term was used, posthumanism, was in 1977 by Hassan. So it's actually not that contemporary. It comes from the 70s. And it's a continuation of anti-humanism, which is what was later called post-structuralism, Deleuze, Foucault, and many other philosophers. And the main aim is overcoming the original humanism, that modern humanism, right? And all the metaphysics of subjectivity that arise from it. Basically, the philosophies and the idea of the human and the subject that start from Descartes until Hegel. It's basically the end of the human-centered world. It's the end of this paradigm. It's the end of anthropocentrism. It's the end of humanism, and this is why it's post-humanism. So the human being is going to be seen as a norm, as a domination, as a false universal, as a discriminator, as even human chauvinism, as an invention of the 18th century. There's going to be a generalized criticism to the idea of the subject, and obviously the idea of the human as well. This type of thinking is obviously going to be very functional to environmentalism, feminism, post-colonialism, as we said, because all these philosophies have one main object, which is overcoming that idea of the human being as the center of all things. And they are going to bring with them also new ways of understanding the subject and obviously understanding the human body. We have different philosophers, all of them alive, contemporaries, Donna Haraway, Catherine Hales, Rosie Braidotti, Robert Pepperell. They are all going to write philosophies that tell us more about this new way of understanding subjectivity, this new way of understanding philosophy, in general, just the posthuman idea. Rosie Braidotti has a book that's called The Posthuman, that is kind of like a posthuman manifesto even at some point. And Robert Pepperell has also a little posthuman manifesto that if you're interested, you can also take a look. So Braidotti says in her book, The Posthuman, she says, not all of us can say with any degree of certainty that we have always been human or that we're only that. Not if by human we mean the creature familiar to us from the Enlightenment and its legacy. So here we have basically a bit of a synthesis of everything we've been seeing. The human being starts being seen as an invention, starts being seen as a construction, starts being seen specifically as an invention of the 18th century. So if before with the postmodern philosophies, we had, these criticisms to the idea of reason, like criticism to the idea of subject. With posthumanism, we start even criticizing the idea of the human. The idea of the human is going to be seen, as we said, as a false universal. Braidotti also says in one of her interviews she gave a few years ago, she says, being human today is a concept under discussion. In fact, I'm not even sure if there's consensus when it comes to defining what it means to be human. The human concept has never been a neutral or inclusive concept. Today, more than ever, the notion of human being is evolving. We are in a moment of criticism of anthropocentrism, of the idea of central species that controls others. And continues Braidotti in her book, she says, the human is a normative convention which does not make an inherently negative, just highly regulatory and hence instrumental to practices of inclusion and discrimination. The human norm stands for normality, normalcy, and normativity. The human is a historical construct that became a social convention about human nature. And to sum up, Robert Pepperell, saying basically that the posthumanism or the posthuman condition is the end of a universe centered on man, or to put it in less phallocentrically, a universe centered on the human. In other words, it is about the end of humanism, of that long-held belief in the infallibility of the human power and the arrogant belief in its superiority and uniqueness. I guess at this point, it's already clear with what we mean by posthumanism. We also said that this posthuman landscape kind of starts giving us the idea that the posthuman landscape is a landscape without humans, because the main target to put down is going to be the idea of the human, seen, as we said, as a social construct, as a false universal, as an invention of the 18th century, and so on and so on. So why is posthumanism an important philosophy to understand our current period? We said before that it was because it's also related to many contemporary philosophies that have a very, let's say, ruling position in contemporary philosophy fields of humanity and academia, and in general, the philosophical tendencies. First of all, posthumanism is functional to environmentalism. Why? Because it proposes, for example, Zoe egalitarianism. Zoe is the idea of life beyond human. So humans are not the main important thing, or we should say humans are not anymore the important thing on the earth, and life exists also beyond the human. So we should create, let's say, a new ethic, a new vitalist, materialist ethic, as Doti says, to put kind of like all species under protection of this new type of ethics, where no species is more important than the other. This creates an idea of having a transpersonal identity and a human identity that includes non-human elements. This is creating a hybrid identity, an identity that conjugates the machine with the organic, the artificial with the natural, and so on and so on. And obviously, it's very functional to all the development of animal ethics, which aim to give more rights to what is the animal field. There's even, on the most extreme side of posthumanism, in the branch of environmentalism, for example, there's a movement called Voluntarily Human Extinction Movement, which is basically a group of people that aims for us to stop reproducing, so that the human species just extinguishes in the planet Earth, and that would be the end of humanity. Basically, we're a problem, we are a big disease, so we need to stop existing. And they call for the extinction of humanity voluntarily. On a second point, posthumanism is also functional to feminism and to queer theory, because it brings very often, especially by the hand of Rosi Braidotti, this idea of becoming woman. The woman seen as the incarnation of that other that we mentioned, the opposite of that Vitruvian man, the opposite of that white European male, etc., etc., being the center of the modern paradigm. Okay, exactly the opposite, or the incarnation of its counterpart, of that other, is feminine, is the woman. So becoming woman, it's a process of becoming that other. This is actually a concept that Goethe takes from Gilles Deleuze, which is becoming animal, becoming earth, and becoming machine, that he wrote in one of his main works. And these terms, in terms of feminism and queer theory, Braidotti, and in general, just posthuman subjectivity, is going to bring the idea of constructing a nomad subject. What is a nomad? It's someone that's all the time moving and migrating to other territories, to other landscapes. So posthuman subjectivity is going to be a nomad subjectivity. You can never be nomad, says Braidotti. You're always being it, because you're always constantly moving and moving. So this idea of becoming, it's very it goes along with the idea of a subject that's all the time being, and there's nothing fixed, because it's all the time becoming. And posthumanity is also very functional to post-colonialism, because of a bit of what we said before, which is the idea of becoming other, the other that was the category put aside by modernity. And they all have in common this overcoming of subjectivity that we mentioned. So first of all, And to get to our fourth and last branch of information about the posthuman landscape, we have to focus now on what is the posthuman body. We just saw we are going like an onion, let's say, with layers. We have the posthuman philosophy, then the posthuman subject, and now the posthuman body, to understand what is the body as landscape in terms of posthumanism. So basically, the main thing is that posthumanists are going to praise for the abolition of limits of the human being and limits between the human being and other entities. Obviously, when you abolish the limits of, you don't have any more limits between, because there's not a concrete limit that defines the shapes. So basically, as Dodi says, we have to shift the structural differences or ontological categories between the organic and the inorganic, the born and the manufactured, the flesh and the metal, the electronic circuits and the organic nervous systems, and so on. Basically creating a hybrid idea of the human being. As Pepperell says, humanists may view humans as distinct beings in an antagonistic relationship with their environment. Posthumanists, on the other hand, see humans as embodied in that extended technological world. Basically, we can just remember a little bit the image of modern times, of Charles Chaplin just being completely caught by that circuit of technology and being just part of that world, of that new world that's being created. As part of another important question, the liquidation of the self, one thing that posthumanists are also going to go against is actually the abolition of the idea of the self. Again, we can just take a little, just remember a little bit the importance of the self that we were talking in terms of modern philosophy, in terms of metaphysics of subject, and when we were mentioning Descartes. So for posthumanists, as Braidotti says, they have to claim a resistance against the dominant forms of representation of the self, because the self is, as Braidotti says, that entity that out of our laziness and habit we call self. So the self, that structural psychological nucleus that defines what every single human being is and is completely singular and intransferable, is going to be seen as something that, because of laziness and because of habit, we call self. And Braidotti is even going to say, the life that is in me does not respond to my name. The I is only something transitory. Again, the idea of subjectivity as a nomad, the idea of subjectivity as a becoming, and the idea of subjectivity as something transpersonal, collective, impersonal, and in a post-identity mode. This is exactly defining new maps of reference of what it is to be a human being, of what it is to understand that singular human being in that world. Why we talk about posthuman landscapes? Because we're talking about new territories. We're talking about new maps of reference, of defining what it is to be a human being. This human being has to be nomad, has to have an identity that's becoming all the time, has to be non-fixed, has to go beyond any type of understanding itself. So on a third part of this block, that's the body of the landscape, we said that technology is going to be one of the main pillars of post-humanity. So informatization, understanding the body as information, is something very, very fundamental in understanding the body as a landscape in terms of posthumanism. So we said that the cybernetic and biotechnological revolution of the mid-20th century brought a new way of understanding the human being, now from the perspective of cybernetics, informatics, and even theory of systems, which is a complete new way of defining what it is an organism. Basically, organisms in terms of algorithms, like Harari says in his book. And obviously, this process of understanding the world and the human being as information, it's nothing but a process of dehumanization and depersonalization, because we wouldn't be dealing with humans anymore, but we're dealing with packages of information. We're systems that produce and generate, process information. We don't, again, deterritorialization It's about finding new grounds, finding new maps of defining the human. This is what posthumanity is about, finding new maps of defining the human. And the map of informatics and algorithms is something fundamental in this new way of understanding the human being that has to be understood today from, in this case, the perspective of informatics and algorithms. Obviously, this creates, this is something that we can probably discuss later, but it creates a very, let's say, an environment that brings many of the bioethical issues about data. There's a epistemological dimension of information, because everything that can be informatized can also be known, because data is traduced into knowledge, right? So in a world where big data, it's all over the place, in a world that has become a massive processor of information, I think in this context, big data comes as basically the manifestation, the expression of a world that's mainly understood in terms of information. Everything can be quantified, everything can be informatized, everything can be computerized. So all that can also be known. And this creates that environment that Shoshana Zuboff defined as surveillance capitalism, a new way of capitalism that makes its capital information. Information becomes the main capital of production of this new way of advanced capitalism. You can basically have an economy around information. So this is a new way of transforming data into also a source, basically, of income in the end, right? And posthumanism kind of like also happens at this crossroad between this advanced capitalism and also this new understanding of subjectivity and the human being, as we said, informatization on one hand, and then the overcoming of subjectivity as we knew it on the other hand. So to understand some definitions by some of the theorists about what is the posthuman subject and what is the posthuman body, Catherine Hales says, the posthuman subject is an amalgam, a collection of heterogeneous components, an informational material entity whose boundaries undergo continuous construction and reconstruction. Braidotti, on the other hand, the posthuman body, it is a multiple information storage system. It is not distinguished from artificial agents or other entities, since it is nothing more than a techno-biophysical social composition. Transsexuality becomes a dominant posthuman topos. The posthuman, says Haraway, in the last paragraph, it is not a singular defined individual, but rather one who can become or embody different identities. So in these three definitions by three different theorists of posthuman thought, we see all this common thread that goes within all of them. It's basically overcoming the established ways and maps of reference of understanding the human being. Even take a look at the vocabulary used. For example, Braidotti in the second one, she says that the human body is a techno-biophysical social composition. That could be the definition, I don't know, of a machine, you know, or something along those lines, but definitely doesn't sound even like a definition of what it is to be a human being. And when we talk about informatization, we said before, as a way of dehumanizing the human, this is what we're talking about, because we start seeing the human not in terms of humanism, not in terms of what it is to be a human, but in terms of these new ways of understanding the human, which is, for example, informatization, understanding the human being as a processor and producer of information, like could be a machine, could be a plant, could be a robot, or anything else. Nothing different, because the human being does not deserve that singularity in terms of posthumanism, as we said. In terms of understanding the human being as information, there's also a rise of different types of movements that kind of like expand this way of thinking. This movement is called the quantified self. Maybe you heard about it. It was also even in the cover of The Economist, and it's basically a group of people that claims let's say the the right and push forward this thesis of understanding yourself from the information. Know you better because the data produce self-knowledge through numbers, basically. And there's obviously a bunch of technologies that start being created in terms of these new philosophies. For example, the Nike Fuel Band, the Withings Sleep Tracking Pad, which are technologies that kind of like track your functioning, your metabolism, your heartbeats, your breathing and everything, and just gather all this information and, in quotes, let you know about yourself through that data. And obviously the main question, probably as a little note, is like, okay, this information is going to be available not only for you, but also by those who own these technologies. We also have the Google Glass in these terms, which was obviously prohibited because it would, I don't know if you know the case, but it's a glass that takes photos and records, and this was infringing the privacy policies of basically anyone around or besides the person wearing them. So it was prohibited in the market. Neuralink, which is this new introduction by Elon Musk, this mini chip that it's put on the brain, and it's, in quotes, made to overcome certain disease. At least in this point, we still don't know the consequences, the next steps that this could be taken to, but this is basically ideas of integration of technology into the human body. We said that the human, the posthuman paradigm draws a new landscape of the human body. So take a look at this diagram that's called Prima Posthuman, done by Natasha Vita-Born. She's actually one of the main transhumanist theorists. And basically, if you take a look at how the human body is depicted, everything that we know as organs, skin, everything, it's just fine in terms of, we could again say the same that we were saying before, in terms of machines, in terms of information systems. It says internal layer, smart skin, external layer, everything is defined. Again, the importance of the vocabulary used makes it seem something very personal, human, because it's defined always in terms of systems and informations and matters that are extra human and that go beyond the human. Also, this project called the 2045 Initiative, and basically aims to, by 2045, arrive to the configuration of the hologram-like avatar, basically after transferring consciousness into a computer and then creating your holographic double, basically. And talking about doubles, digital twins, something also very introduced, you probably know about it. Again, a new technology introduced in the field of medicine and in general, just clinical realms, that also brought up many bioethical issues in terms of this, basically, which is reproducing your own profile in a digital platform, and that puts in risk the idea of autonomy of the patient. So the reason why we talk about posthumanism as a new geography and the landscape of this new posthuman body, as the new ways of understanding the human being that await us in this new posthuman context, actually made me think about posthumanism as a radical exile. I actually take a little bit of advantage of this platform and announced that just a few weeks ago, my book was published that's called Posthumanism or the Radical Exile, precisely because of the process of deterritorialization that means posthumanity, this exile, this forcing the human of leaving its territory, forcing it to exile and to go explore new ways of defining the human landscape. Obviously, there's some philosophies before posthumanism that were already bringing some of these ideas. We said that anti-humanism put some of the grounds, this idea of the body without organs from Deleuze and Guattari, which is this idea of, we have to metaphysically get rid of organs of the body because organs are what give body an order. So we need to get rid of everything that a priori, gives the body an order, a hierarchy, and so on. So the body without limits is basically the body as a landscape for posthumanism. It's a body without limits. It's a body like a rhizome that just grows in all connections and networks, like a machine, like a part of a machine that can be an annex to another machine, and so on. Obviously, it's a body that does not have a clear difference between the inside and the outside. Obviously, it's a body that goes beyond aesthetics, beyond metaphysics, beyond beauty, anatomy, biology, anthropology, and all these categories that had defined the human being before. And then the category of the mutant, the category of trans, the category of cyborg are going to be very, very relevant categories of understanding the subjectivities of the post-human, because these are all categories that are hybrid and that are functional to these new ways of understanding the human being that we mentioned. As Robert Pepperell says, there's nothing external to a human being because the extension of a human being cannot be fixed. So the post-human subject is a subject without limits, is a subject without clear, defined, and drawn limit. These are some actually examples of posthuman artists. For example, Neil Harbison has an antenna from his head that allows him to basically hear colors, and Moore Ribas has a mini chip under her skin that allows her to feel the earthquake movements, the tectonic plaque movements, and she dances along these feelings that she gets. Fecal matter and salvia, other static posthumanist representatives, we see basically bodies. The landscape of the posthuman body is a body that can become anything. It's a body that can become anything because it's a body that's beyond metaphysics, anthropology, biology, aesthetics, and anything. It's body beyond the limits. And this is the main idea of understanding the posthuman body as a new landscape for the future of humanity. For example, the first image is basically a body that can become a corpse before dying because it's metaphysically death. There's nothing that determines this body, so the body can become anything, even a corpse, before dying, obviously. Again, other images of fecal matter. And Braidotti asks, for example, so what happens to subjectivity? Complex field of forces of data flows, it becomes an expanded relational self engendered by the cumulative effect of all these factors. The relational capacity of the post-human subject is not confined with our species, but it includes all non-anthropomorphic elements. And the posthuman is not a singular defined individual, but rather one who can become and embody different identities and understand the world with multiple and heterogeneous perspectives, says Haraway. So now, as a conclusion, and to start finishing and summing up our presentation, to rethink the notion of borders, it's something essential when thinking about the posthuman subject. What could we do in terms of revising the posthuman project? The first thing would be rethinking the notion of borders, basically. The body, limit, we can say. Our human bodies are a limit, are a form. They define the singular way of being in the world that each of us have, that we'll always have. It's the absolute line that defines the way we look, we are, we exist in the world. The limit, it's that absolute division, let's say, between the outside and the inside. And any living form has a limit. It's not metaphysical, abstract exercise. Even the cell has a membrane that it doesn't exclude the cell from all the other cells and organisms, but it defines its shape. It allows the cell to be alive, to do its functions, to interact with the environment. The limit, it's something that's essential for the constitution of anything that's alive. Without limits, there can't be life. And the idea of limit also creates this dialectical, negative, let's say, capacity of the human being. The human being separates itself from the object in order to know it, for example, in terms of epistemology. The subject separates itself from the other to define itself, for example, in terms of identity. The subject separates from nature to develop history, technology, even art, and so on. So there's always a process in which the human separates in order to create, which is, for example, the case of the Vitruvian Man. We saw it in the beginning, of a human being that's not repressed by that circle or that square, but quite the contrary, those mathematical lines are defining the shape of that body. It's a body with limits in this case. So what are the main questions we can ask ourselves in terms of understanding the posthuman landscape and the posthuman idea of the world that is being drawn? First of all, what are the limits of tomorrow's world? How are we going to define tomorrow's world? And second, what is the territory of subjectivity in that world, of tomorrow's world? Basically, why we focus on the idea of borders, again, with the terminology of geography, to understand the posthuman landscape, is a landscape, it seems, without limits. Because first of all, without limits, there's no distinction between the inside and the outside. There's no distinction between the subject and the object. No distinction between the self and the other. No distinction between the private and the public. No distinction between the state and the individual. No distinction between the human and the non-human. Basically, without limits, the human disappears, not because we're understanding the limit as an exclusive element because it excludes other things, but quite the contrary, because it's a condition of possibility of things. It's the condition of possibility of the human. So the idea of limits is not only a philosophical idea, it's not only a geographical idea, but it's even in the end a political idea. It's a very structural idea in conceiving the individual that many of these new philosophies, when drawing the future landscapes of the human, are not seeing, and that they're actually, as we say, preparing the soil for many problematics, not only in terms of bioethics, but also in terms of politics, with their new ideas of subjectivity. So we said the subject, now as a conclusion about the subject as a limit. So the subject is a limit because it's structured with a priori categories of reason. That's an epistemological idea, let's say. In terms of Kant, the subject is a limit because it's structured. It has a limited way of understanding things, which mark the conditions of possibility of knowledge. So we don't have an undefined human mind, but we have a concrete, limited, structured human mind with a priori categories. Second, the subject is a limit because it marks the difference between the inside and the outside, like we said before, with all these distinctions. The subject is a limit because an immunity, because it marks a difference between what am I and what happens to the world. It kind of like creates a barrier, for example, from ideology, political, let's say, ideology and type of, let's say, hypodermic type of getting inside the subject. And lastly, the subject is a limit because it distances itself to create. As we said, it separates from things in terms of creating and coming back and creating a new form. And now to start also making a conclusion, how to organize chaos, says Régis Debray in his book Elegy of the Fronters, and he says, drawing a line separating the inside from the outside. And now as conclusions, so the Posthuman project has concrete implications in what we understand by body and by subjectivity. Second, it is not the only possible future because they always propose it as the only possible future existing out there. And this is obviously not the case of imagining the future landscapes. And thirdly, it is a public and a global matter, and it concerns to all of us like humans, basically like individuals belong to the human species. We have to be aware of these new ways that are being drawn and planned to understand the future of the human world. And now we can say in terms of a summary. So the categorical imperative of environmentalism tells us that an environmental responsibility is necessary at all costs. This is basically the typical environmental critique to anthropocentrism. But don't we also need people that create a creative responsibility to maintain the hygiene and the homeostasis of the human-made environment? I mean, basically, you can't take care of the world that we created. It's even harder that we can take care of the world we haven't created. So first, as humans, as responsible creatives, intellectuals, technologists, we should be able to take care of the world we created, we crafted, the world we have a direct responsibility on, and then be focused on trying to protect also the world that's on a second level, out of our direct creation and let's say activity and practice. What we do today is actually witnessing, in terms of posthumanism, the expulsion of the subject from its own territory. This is what posthumanism is in the end, an overcoming of the classical humanist understandings of what it is to be a human and proposing new territories of understanding it, territories that obviously bring many, many implications that have to be revised, have to be analyzed. And as a summary, this is an extract from my book, The Radical Exiled, or Posthumanism, and it says, as in Pripyat, the shock wave of posthumanism is responsible for eliminating the subjects without affecting the objects, process that outlines the first image of a world without humans. Posthumanism pulverizes the subjects without touching the objects. Everything remains the same, everything remains intact, but something small has changed. There is no world. By world, here we mean the world for the human, the world as a representation for the human world. So posthumanism is in this way, obviously, a direct aim, a clear aim of overcoming this idea that we had of the human, this idea that we had of the individual as a subject that is really worth revising and worth going through for these new landscapes of the future. And basically, to sum up, and with this I'm going to close my presentation, we don't need future to design humans. We need to design a more human future. Thank you very much for listening to the presentation.